Thank you, Jim, and good morning to everyone. This is like the most sprawling crowd I've probably ever presented at, but I'll do my best here. I have a plant blocking me from that table, but it's all good. So I am, as Jim said, the city manager and port CEO of the city of West Sacramento. Most of my career has been in West Sacramento. I kind of live and breathe that city. I'm a resident myself. I have the pleasure of being the city manager now. I was spent most of my career in, as Jim said, in redevelopment, doing lots of work around affordable housing, brownfield redevelopment, lots of grant writing, lots of all-nighters at City Hall. But for the last 6.5 years, I've been in the role that I'm currently in. Part of the joy of that is attending council meetings. And last night, our meeting was a short one, went till 11 p.m. Got 4 hours of sleep, was on a plane this morning. But it's great to be here. I used to be, thank you, thanks for that. I used to be a regular at we called it the CCLR conference back then, the Western Brownfields Workshop, EPA conferences. So I see a lot of faces that I haven't seen in a long time, which is really cool. But it's really great to be here today. It really has been about 20 years since we got active in some of the projects you're gonna see. However, the story is much longer than that in West Sac. I'm going to do my best to give you some context around each of these case studies. But more so, what I hope you'll take away from it, whether your community is large or small, or your projects are various sizes, there are some key takeaways, key themes woven throughout that will apply just about anywhere to any project. We're going to try to highlight, especially for those of you that are California-based, which I think is almost everybody, the key financing or funding terms that we used in most of our projects. So hopefully that'll resonate for you as well. So first, I just wanted to give a little background about our city beyond what I just did. So just to make things confusing, we're a directional city, West Sacramento. We're right across the river from downtown Sacramento. However, we're not in Sacramento County. We're in Yolo County, which is the most underutilized marketing name for a county probably in the world. We are a very large employment center. So we have about 60,000 residents, but almost half that number in terms of jobs in our city. So the daytime population is very much larger than just our residential population. We have a lot of back and forth between us and Sacramento. So fairly large city. We have only been incorporated for a little over 35 years, back in '87. I'll get into the story on that, but the funny part of that is we were called the East Yolo Services District, and now we're West Sacramento, so it just flipped. There were other names they thought about, but we settled on that one. So we are a full-service city, meaning that we do everything, just about everything besides, I think, animal services and library, which is county functions. I already have one correction to my slide here. We actually have an operating budget of more like $225 million, so $50 million rounding error there, sorry about that. But that's mainly because we also operate a lot of special districts. We have a flood control agency, we have our tax increment district I'll talk about, we have the port. Also serve as the port CEO because of that. And more importantly, it's our capital improvement plan. We have a huge CIP for a city of our size. The current number is around $500 million, but that's just the local share. That's just the part that we're coming up with. We're building bridge projects with Sacramento over the river. Those alone are $500 million projects. So just some context about West Sacramento. You look at this slide here, and this is not our city. This is actually downtown Sacramento. It's from the east looking west towards West Sac. At the foreground, you'll see the state capitol. Right in the middle of that picture, you'll see Golden One Center, which is the newish arena where the Sacramento Kings play. What that project represented was really a conscious shift in the city of Sacramento to move the kind of the economic center, the entertainment center of the region more towards the river, more towards the area that we're right across from. But you look across the river, and you can see it kind of in the background there, that's West Sacramento. What you might notice there and kind of wonder is like, well, why is it not as developed? Why are the buildings shorter? Why is there so much vacant space over there? What happened? One thing I will point out you might not notice is the presence of Interstate 5, the freeway that runs along the river in the Sacramento side. That's the best thing that never happened to us. Macy's, when it moved to downtown Sacramento, wanted the freeway right by them, and so we had the fortune of having that plan shift over to their side of the river. I'll get to what was on our side of the river because it wasn't pretty, but it's way better than having a freeway that you're never going to get rid of. Okay. Oh, sorry. This kind of tells the picture. This is a picture from 1947. You can see on the left side, that's West Sacramento. Back then it was East Yolo. And there's really nothing there. There were a few things, though. The main thing, it was the old state highway, the Lincoln Highway that connected from the Bay Area up to Sacramento and points eastward. And because of that, this is a picture looking to the east, that is West Sacramento in the foreground and the old highway. Because of that, we had a predominance of auto-related uses, including motels. At one point, there were probably 30 plus motels situated along that strip. Many of you are from communities where you might have similar downtown environments where that existed. In our case, it was sort of extreme. We were RV parks, motels, auto-related uses, and that kind of tells our story a little bit it's a foreshadow to our brownfield situation. So what happened though was and one other thing, this is a good example of this was a motel in West Sacramento. They had the Capitol, we had the Capitol Inn. This is actually on the site of where our current city hall is. So there's a lot of history in West Sacramento that looks similar to this. But what happened was, much like in all these other communities, when the interstates got built, it bypassed our city. We had Interstate 80 on one side, Highway 50 on the other. They go through our city, but they bypassed West Capitol Avenue. And so some of you may remember the movie Cars, and I like to use this analogy. Some of you probably saw that movie with your kids back in 2004. Some of you probably saw it as kids, probably more of you. But it's a great analogy for towns like West Sacramento, where this is a screenshot from the movie where Radiator Springs was on the old highway, had a bustling downtown, then they built Interstate 40 next to it. All the cars were so excited that, hey, we're gonna get all these freeway travelers, but it didn't really happen. They got bypassed, their economy went to in the tank, and they had to adapt. Our version of Radiator Springs, because we didn't have Lightning McQueen to save us, became this. Just let that set in for a second. This was West Sacramento. This is a real headline from 1989. Our city was known. It was a laughingstock of the region. It was a punchline. The West Capitol Avenue corridor became exactly what this says. And that's the hand we were dealt when we incorporated as a city. The other part was the riverfront. We had this amazing riverfront potential. However, most of the uses along the riverfront were from a date that went back to riverfront port business. So now we have deep water ports. There's one down the street, Long Beach. It's a big one. We have one in West Sacramento that serves the agricultural industry, but this was what it was before. There were barging and there was lots of rail lines. None of this, as I'll explain, was the type of brownfields that, say, Ignacio probably dealt with in Emeryville, fortunately, but there were a lot of problems we had to deal with just to get the first bit of redevelopment accomplished in West Sacramento. So what we had working against us were a few things, some I've already mentioned, but one of the big ones was we had all sorts of landowners that weren't really aligned, and so that was something we had to affect when we had our redevelopment agency. We did a lot of property acquisition. I mentioned the rail lines and highways. The main thing, we had vision, but we didn't have sort of the ingredients it takes to realize that vision, the main one being infrastructure. So that was another detriment. Brownfields, of course, perceived and real. We had many of those, and many we're still dealing with, but especially along that riverfront area. However, on the flip side, it's a great riverfront location. We're in the center of the cultural and economic center of Sacramento, right across from downtown. So all the things were there to have it make sense, and it's really why the public agencies exist. We were there to intervene and remove those barriers and bring about some of the successes we have today. So just to set some context, we have essentially 4 riverfront planning districts. The city was very, to its credit in the early days, was very conscious of, hey, we need to have good land use plans and lots of vision here, and we did that. We were really good at that, but we were really bad at implementation for a few years. So we had essentially these planning districts. I'm going to talk about projects in each one of them, north to south. The Washington district's really the oldest part of the city. It's the old grid, 1880s infrastructure at one point. The Bridge District is the area you already saw on the slide that I talked about with all the rice mills and everything. And then further down, I'll get into the rest of the riverfront that was and kind of still is afflicted with some of the remnants of the past, including petroleum tank farms. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on our first case study. I think we have about 5 or 6. The Bridge District is the one that is probably best known in West Sacramento and the one I like talking about the most. So again, this is what it looked like back around the time of incorporation, around 1987. Like I said, we spent a lot of time and resources on doing land use planning. So we came up with a specific plan. Probably the most important concepts in that, it was very much an urban scale, urban standards. We're trying to build sustainable transit-oriented development there. with a mix of housing types, a mix of affordability, a mix of land uses, and that's what that plan really spoke to. What it didn't at first, which we amended it in 2009 and kind of fixed it, is it wasn't very realistic about the infrastructure it would take to actually realize that type of development. We're talking 12 million square feet of total real estate. That's a lot. 5,000 housing units is the total capacity, but there was no infrastructure in place to support any of that. So we developed a capital plan that was at the time about $65 million in just the first phase alone for backbone infrastructure. In today's dollars, it's probably double that because this was over 10 years ago. Just to put things in perspective, this was done back when everyone was chasing after the Amazon headquarters, HQ2. What the hell are we doing there? But we did. It never happened. But this was done by one of our developers just to depict what 12 million square feet of real estate looks like. So this is what you could do in the Bridge District if it was fully built out. But to get there, we had to have a very ambitious, very aggressive approach. We started with, and because we had our redevelopment agency at the time, up until 2012, much of the resources and the powers of the redevelopment agency focused on the Bridge District. We did a lot of land assembly, lots of demolition work, relocations of both rail lines, but also businesses that were in the Bridge District that we relocated to other parts of the city using redevelopment. Like I said, we did a first phase of backbone infrastructure, very complicated mix of funding sources that I'll get to. But the most important thing we had at that point was we had investors in the private sector that were serious and wanted to see it happen, were ready to put their money behind it. And that is obviously a key ingredient to any kind of economic development success. So the brownfield issues in the Bridge District, I alluded to this, they weren't the type where we had, say, one user that was so bad that we had to, call it a Superfund site and take years and years and years to clean up. We also had the benefit, because we were doing so much terraforming, we were basically tearing up all the old infrastructure. What we did is an area-wide approach. We did phase ones to the areas that we needed to focus more on. We did phase twos. There was a lot of grant funding involved, a lot of process working with the Water Board and DTSC and our consultants like SCS and others. And at the end of the day, when we did the infrastructure project, we also addressed the brownfield issues that were out there for that first phase. So the funding mix it's almost like looking at, if you've seen a pro forma for an affordable housing project, that's about what it was. The three key points here I'll make without going into all the detail is it was a key mix of state, local, and ultimately property owner funding. So the state, this was in the first round back in 2008. I did many all-nighters for this one. This was the infill infrastructure program. We were in round one of that program. We got $23 million from the state of California to help build the infrastructure. The trade-off to that is we committed to building housing. The second piece was redevelopment. We had about, whatever the number is, about $11 million of tax increment financing in that project. And no matter where you're from, what state you're from, I was talking to a couple of people about this before, tax increment financing is kind of the bread and butter for local funding when it comes to our contribution to things like redeveloping brownfield sites. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the new version of that, which we have. It's an EIFD, and how that's played into some of the other projects. But the other part that's on there, the second funding source, the $16 million, was actually from a CFD, a Community Facilities District, or Melrose District. If you're familiar with those, it's the property owners taxing themselves to help pay for the infrastructure. So because of all those different sources and many other grant funds, we were able to move ahead with this very huge scale infrastructure project. You can see kind of the progress on the right side. But we do have future phases of this to build parking structures and other improvements that will really support that really high density development that we're planning to see. And it's going to be a mix of many of the same sources that we had before, with the EIFD now replacing what was redevelopment tax increment. This is what it kind of looks like today. On the left is kind of the southern end of the Bridge District. That's about 700-800 units of housing there, including affordable housing mixed in there. On the right side is sort of the northern area, which you can see there's still a lot of vacant land. A lot of the office entitlements are over there. If anyone's ever going to build an office building again, let me know. But we have one of our first mixed-use projects, large-scale mixed-use projects right on the riverfront that just opened over in that area too, and I'll talk about the ballpark in a second. These are just some pictures of some of the housing just to give you a glimpse of the scale and the types of uses that we're seeing there. Most of it's been done by one developer, so we're fortunate to have a very engaged development partner there. This is the project I just mentioned that has a mixed-use component along the river, and on the other side of it is a trail that we've installed going from one end of the Bridge District to all the way to the north, about 2 miles up. And that's going to continue down the river as we further develop some of these other areas. So we did put a really strong emphasis on parks, open space, and public art. You can see here surrounding the main area of housing is a nice neighborhood scale park. Lots of public art installations, including one that was a tribute back to the old rice mills that were there. There was a pier that we inherited, and it was very dilapidated, but rather than pull it out, we actually reinvested in it. We created a public pier. It's the only one on the Sacramento River now. Very unique space. It has this big west sign that sometimes rotates if it works. But it's a really cool spot on our river. If you're ever up there, I'd encourage you to check it out. And then another place is the barn. This is a confusing project if you're looking at it, trying to figure out what it is. Think of it as part brewery, part event, concert space, and part public art. And it's an event venue more or less, but Drake's Brewing Company is the tenant. It's a great place. It's indoor-outdoor, great place to have food and a beer on a nice night, which we have many of in the Sacramento climate, except when it's 110 degrees. And then the ballpark. This is what I get the most questions about these days, and unless you've been not paying attention to the world, or the sports world anyway, you should know that the Oakland A's are relocating to Sacramento, to West Sacramento for the next 3 seasons. I'm not going to tell you much about it because it's kind of a mix of things, but what's important to know is this stadium was built way back at the beginning of the redevelopment phase for a AAA team, the Sacramento River Cats, who are still going to play there. And it was seen at the time as a key catalyst to other things happening. It didn't quite pan out that way right away because we had to go in and put more infrastructure in, clean up brownfields, and do all the work I just described. But it is a key cog in the overall Riverfront area, and with this new energy for the next 3 seasons, we expect it to have some benefits to the further momentum on the West Sac side of the river. I mentioned affordable housing. This is the proof. We did do several affordable housing projects within the first few phases of our Riverfront development. The one on the upper left was done by Bridge Housing, which I don't remember what the specific brownfield issues were, but I know we had to do some remediation there. And a lot of this was actually funded. The assessment funding came from EPA grants, among other sources. So just a shout out to anyone from EPA and DTSC for that matter. We had other grant funding from them to thank you for the help on the Bridge District. These are just some graphics of what's coming. On the upper part is a campus that is underway. It's not under construction yet, but we're targeting, our developer has chosen to kind of target the biotech industry. It's kind of it's not new, but it's sort of an emerging field up in Sacramento especially. There's a lot of interest in rather than just traditional office spaces, getting lab spaces and more R&D type uses. So working on that. The one on the bottom though is actually under construction right now. It's an office building, believe it or not. It's the developer's office and another West Sac construction company. It's a very big company, mixed with about 300 units of housing and almost a resort-like amenity around it, right next to the barn. So we're really happy about that project because it's a mix of everything: retail, housing, office. So again, this is what we were dealt with when we incorporated. This was the Bridge District back in probably 1987. This is where we hope to go someday. Maybe not like this exactly, and not with Amazon as our key tenant. But that gives you a picture of the scale we're looking at. And this is what it looks like today. So I think given that this was really just the last 10 years of work, yes, there's still a lot of vacant land that are opportunity sites for future development, but the key ingredients are already there to create this really vibrant mixed-use riverfront that's really just starting off. It's just getting going. I think in 10 years from now, it's going to be vastly different and look more like that second picture. The second case study I want to talk about, we call it our Grand Gateway area. You remember this slide? It's that area. This area now looks like this. In West Sac, we're really good at buying stuff and tearing it down. I'm serious about that. We bought a lot of motels. We bought, just in my tenure as city manager, I think we just closed on 2 yesterday. I think we're up to 8 motels. Because it really is the only answer to kind of get those uses away from what they are now, which is really housing a last resort. We're converting many of them to temporary supportive housing for people who are otherwise homeless or were living in motels already. And as we move down the street, because we have about 30 of them to go, or actually 22 remaining, who's counting? This site is a good representation of what our plan is long term. We buy the motels, we run them as a temporary program, we tear them down, and we redevelop them for mixed-use development, including affordable housing. So Grand Gateway was assembled by the Redevelopment Agency back in the 90s. From the list is there, several motels, a bunch of undesirable uses. There was actually a highway there, and it's hard to see, but on the right-hand side, you can see what was an off-ramp and an on-ramp. That actually got taken down when we did the bridge district. We literally tore down a freeway and brought it down to an urban scale street. And that made up part of the site that the Grand Gateway development ultimately developed. And I know a lot of you, and if you're from a city, you have these old highways. That's actually a really great way to accumulate real estate that can be repurposed for better use. If you get those sites relinquished from the state of California, which we did, you can use the land much more efficiently. So we did a master plan, we did an RFP, we awarded a development agreement to a developer who's going to do a really cool project there. But along the way, these were two of the motels that we bought. We found underground storage tanks. Go figure. And they predated the motel, back from way before the original highway use, probably some auto-related use, not the type of vintage that you worry about MTBE or anything like that. So they were fairly simple cleanups, but we did use EPA funding for these, for assessment and cleanup. And I'll just note, in case you're worried about the little horse in front of the old town, it now has a new home in rural Yolo County. I can't tell you where, but it did get relocated. These motels got torn down and they're now part of this site. This is what it looks like today. We did put in a parking lot as a piece of infrastructure to help the first phase of development. And what it's going to look like is, like I said, a mix of uses. It's going to have a hotel, a few mixed-use projects, an affordable housing development. All in all, it's about 400 units, probably 100 or so unit motel. And kind of the next best thing we can do to having a downtown along West Capitol Avenue. We don't really have a downtown in West Sacramento. So between the Riverfront and this site, that gives us a sort of a community center that will look and feel like a downtown environment. The third case study is one I'm particularly proud of. It's our first permanent supportive housing project. It started, much like the other site, with a few motels that were repurposed. West Sac has much like most of the cities in California, we have a homeless problem, and one that is mainly the result of not having the adequate resources and the right type of housing to address the long-term need of the population. So there's been this shift in thinking, and I think it's for the good in the last 10 years or so, to build more permanent supportive housing as the long-term solution to where people who are experiencing chronic homelessness are given the best outcomes. And so this site was targeted for that several years ago. We worked with a couple of nonprofits and our county to bring about the redevelopment of this site into an 87-unit permanent supportive housing project. Didn't necessarily anticipate it becoming a brownfield, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim really quick to talk about our approach to this one. You can see on this slide, we had to install a vapor barrier. And
yeah, this was one of our favorite projects. There is still site impact, but it lends itself to mitigation through a vapor barrier. And so we designed that, the contractor installed it, the building got built, we did testing, and the best part of the story is that as we completed our second phase of testing, we had alerted the water board about the need to turn around their review on our report. So literally within 2 hours on Christmas Eve, they reviewed and approved the report, and that put people in beds in 85 units that were otherwise homeless. So, really, it's an example of collaboration between agencies and the city and a consultant. And shout out to Central Valley Water Board.
Yeah, definitely. There was originally, I don't know if that program's still around, the Orphan Site Cleanup Account, OSCA, that was way back when, but that was part of the funding that went into the assessment and cleanup of the site. Like Jim said, it was 85 units. We're now in the process, the motels I mentioned that we just closed on yesterday, I just signed yesterday, are right next door. So we're assembling the rest of that site. We're hoping to put a clinic that serves the whole community, among other uses at that site. It'll be a good complement to the permanent supportive housing next door. This slide is modeled after a presentation I think that was on Tuesday that SCS did about stacking your capital for a project. Some of our projects take years and years and years, and the funding sources are very complex and very many. In this one, it fit nicely into this model. So this is a slide that kind of shows the different funding sources that came into the permanent supportive housing project from the early stage on, from assessment to construction. So it's a good example of how to use that capital stack model. The next project is a very small but meaningful one to us. It was a former fire station. You can see on the pictures on the right, back in the 1940s, it operated as a fire district for what was then known as the Washington neighborhood. the town of Washington, unincorporated area. It was a Depression-era work progress administration building. We don't have a lot of history left in West Sacramento that is, frankly, notable to save. We have a lot of old motels, but we don't have a lot of historic structures. This one, we actually worked with the developer to get it designated. But in order to do that, it was a long story. It was the city owned it. We inherited it from the county when we incorporated. The police station actually had their first location there for a number of years. But since 1993 to when we redeveloped it, about 20 years later, it was not used, and it was really unfortunate. It fell into major disrepair. At one point, there were like 1,000 bats in there. I remember going through there with flashlights and having to warn people, just keep walking, ignore the bats. We were trying to get someone to redevelop it, and you can imagine it was a tough job. But it wasn't a great location. There were lots of things happening around it. We saw it as a potential asset for the community. And so fortunately, we found a developer that was crazy enough to work with us on a redevelopment project. However, next door is probably the most contaminated site in West Sacramento, which is a former plating shop. So this site, we did, working with DTSC from way back when to do all the assessment work. I'll let Jim kind of talk about some of the approach to that, but long story short, we tried many different avenues, including Gatto Act legislation, which sort of is a new thing. It's the son of the Polanco Act, if you're familiar with that. Hopefully you're not. But it's a legal mechanism that's intended to hold the responsible parties liable for cost recovery. In this case, we were going after their insurance assets, and it was mostly unsuccessful, but it was a good exercise because it allowed us to settle with a lot of the previous owners that were RPs, and now we own it. So now we're going to have to, kind of eat it and go after cleanup funding. So if you're from EPA or DTSC, please send money. But it's a great site. The fortunate thing through the assessment work that Jim can touch on, we were able to determine that the Firehouse was largely unaffected by it, absent some minor cleanup we had to do in the parking lot. So do you want to?
Yeah, the contamination is primarily metals related to the plating. And so luckily that isn't as mobile as some of the other chemicals we run into during assessment and remediation. So that allowed a lot of that to be either to remain on site or to relocate it to to an area where the bridge landing may happen.
Right, and I'll show you in a second the new bridge that we're building. So yep.
Yeah.
All right, and so the result of all that, we were able to complete this project almost 10 years ago now. Like I mentioned, we placed it on the National Register of Historic Places. It was the first property in West Sacramento that has that designation. And it was redone as a really cool restaurant that it kind of pays homage to the history of West Sacramento. We didn't ask them to do that, but it almost serves like a museum for our little city. Upstairs, it's an event venue. It opened first as a jazz club, but now they're trying to figure out how to manage it. But it's a really cool site, given that we owned it. We sort of neglected it, but it came full circle through reinvestment with our private partner. And the cleanup work that we did and the assessment work that we did next door to reduce the risk, it now is a community asset like we hoped it would become. Okay. And in the neighborhood, partly why we're so bullish about this area, it's right on the river. It's just to the north of the Bridge District. Some of you have probably seen the Ziggurat building on national broadcast for sports games. For some reason, they show that in the Tower Bridge. It's like all we are in Sacramento. We're way more than that, but that's what they show you. So the building next to that, though, is the CalSTRS headquarters. The second biggest pension fund in the world is located in this neighborhood. So we're investing a lot in it. Others are responding. It's really encouraging to see. And like Jim mentioned, there's a new bridge that's replacing the old rail bridge that's landing right at the foot of where that project is. So some of the soil that needed to be relocated will become part of the abutments of that bridge. The next case study, I'm almost done with these. I've got a couple more, but this one is actually in progress. It's on the southern side of the riverfront. If you go south of the Bridge District, we call that area Pioneer Bluff. It's kind of the highest area of the riverfront. When they dredged the Sacramento River back in the day, they would put the dredge spoils on the site. It was also one of the first developed sites for industrial use on the West Sacramento side. And unfortunately, much of that use was petroleum tank farms. Back in the day when they barged in fuel before they did the pipelines up from places like Richmond and Benicia, they would load the tank farms from barges, and so we had all of them on the river. Sacramento has some on their side as well. So one of them, it's in this picture, it's actually vacant now. I don't know if this works. Sorry, right there. That was a tank farm that belonged to Shell. It had been there since pre-World War II. In that picture on the top right, that's it right there. I don't have one that showed it at that vintage, but it's been there a really long time. We had this theory, and by the way, we have a land use plan in that area that contemplates it as mixed-use development, so all this is non-conforming. We have a great story for our regulators to say, hey, this is going to be housing someday, so we need your help in pushing some of this stuff along. In this case, we had this theory that you look around the region, and there's an oversupply of tank farm storage. You look at gas consumption, and it's on its way down for lots of reasons. We want to get ahead of that. We don't want to lose to Sacramento in terms of being able to get rid of one of these tank farms, and so strike while iron's hot. We approached Shell, we did a little dance with them for a while, and we figured out they didn't want to be in the tank farm business. They're an energy company, they sell a brand. They don't want to store it, it's liability to them. So we ended up settling on a deal where we agreed to buy the property. We're actually having the port buy the property. That's a long story I won't get into, but the port is buying the property. Shell agreed to take care of the decommissioning of the tank farm, the demolition, and the cleanup to a residential standard. And that may seem a little crazy, but given the fact that it was a tank farm, through some and Jim can talk about what they're actually doing, but through the site remediation, we anticipate taking ownership of it as a clean site with full remediation within the next couple of years. And the deal is we are going to pay them $3 million for that property. They wanted the money based on how much it's going to cost them to clean it up, not based on the real estate value. We anticipate in future dollars, once we are able to redevelop the site, it's going to be worth at least twice, maybe 3 times that much. So we think it's a good model for how to work with an RP on kind of meeting mutual interests. In this case, it's been really successful as a linchpin to what we're doing elsewhere in the Pioneer Bluff district for reuse of those sites. Jim, do you want to talk about this one?
Another cool aspect of this, again, is collaboration with the regulator. So the City of West Sacramento and SCS went in and met with the Water Board, Central Valley Water Board again, and they agreed to require a cleanup to residential standard to enable the mixed-use redevelopment, even though currently it was, or at the time, tank farms. But because the city had the plan and zoning, that allowed it to be easy for the Water Board to say yes.
Yeah, and like I said, it's underway right now. We are looking to assemble the site with other property. There used to be a cement storage facility to the north that's now vacant, and it'll become sort of the southern extension of the type of development we're already doing in the Bridge District, and it'll just continue on down the river. We also have a corporation yard that we're relocating. I'll go back to this right here, and an old sewage treatment plant that the city actually owns. So that project, in combination with the case study we're going to talk about next, will really lead the way to the Pioneer Bluff area becoming not exactly like the Bridge District, but probably more on the residential scale. But it's an amazing riverfront site when you go out there. It's got unfettered views of the downtown skyline, an amazing view of the river, kind of 180 degrees up and down because of the curve. So we're really looking forward to it. I don't think it'll happen in my career, but whoever comes next is going to have a lot of cool work to do in this area. So the last case study we wanted to talk about, and we have a little demo of a story map that Jim's going to go over for this project, just to make things as complicated as possible for us in West Sacramento. Back in the 1960s, the Army Corps of Engineers decided, you know what, we need to have a second port in California, inland port. We have Stockton, but let's put another one in Sacramento. And so they decided on West Sacramento. They dug a 43-mile channel up from the bay to what became our city, right in the middle of it. And a port was put there. Then they doubled down on that and said, you know what, we should really connect this thing to the Sacramento River. I'm told that it had to do with, because it was the Cold War era, they wanted to have redundancy in being able to get military equipment and jet fuel up to the air bases in Sacramento. And so the logic was, hey, locks, let's do a lock, because that works in other places. So I'm not sure other than Seattle, there's other locks on the West Coast to speak of. This one was opened in 1961. It probably operated for maybe 20 years on a very light basis. And then it closed. And back in 2000, the Army Corps of Engineers and our redevelopment agency made a deal that, hey, we'll take that off your hands. They gave us a whole lot of property, but it was a difficult site to develop. And one of the reasons is because this is in the middle of it. So it's an old shipping lock. However, the way we like to think of things in West Sacramento is not to look at sort of the challenge with it, but look at the opportunity. And in this one, we envision it as a really cool potential recreation center. Not everyone has a lock in the middle of their city, and so with some redevelopment work and some area development around the area, we think it can become something really unique and really cool as an attraction, both for visitors but also for new development around the lock area. And we have the property around it to support that. There's over, I think, almost 200 acres of vacant property that we received with it. So on this project, it's got some unique features that require unique cleanup approaches, and Jim's firm did a great job working with our staff on developing a story map for this project, and hopefully it's an example for you if you have similar projects, brownfield projects that you'd like to show the public and other stakeholders both the history, the plan, and the future. This is a really good example. So Jim's going to walk you through this.
And I will say that for Stone Lock, there was a lot of assessment done from phase 1s, phase 2s, building material surveys. We did safety plan. We used EPA grant funds for some of the other sort of reuse and planning aspects that you wouldn't necessarily think about for EPA grants. So we developed a safety plan because the site, it was fallen into disrepair. There were homeless folks living there, drug use, things that you don't really want in these historic buildings. So the safety plan talked about fencing, lighting, how to safely at least contain that site with the ultimate idea that it was going to be redeveloped and reused. So with that, the story map was the last part that came out of it. And that was funded by City of West Sacramento and EPA grant funding.
Yeah, we used EPA assessment grant funding. You're able to do cleanup planning or planning work, and so this was a part of what was funded with that grant.
And this is on the City of West Sacramento's website for anybody that's interested. It's also part of this presentation. Bless you. So what you see is sort of a depiction of a vision of the city, the Stone Lock area. And so story maps, for those unfamiliar, they tell a past, present, and a desired future. There are clickable icons that bring up key bits of information or photos or what have you. Let's see if we can get. That's a picture of the lock now. Here is something about the history of development. Aaron showed you that. And then we have these icons that talk about different aspects of the Deepwater Channel leading up to the lock. So for instance, icon 4. You zoom in, then there are other icons that, sorry.
And so some of this was done because there are people in our city, probably most people in our city, who have lived here for a long time that have no idea that we have a lock or why we have a lock. So part of it was just telling the story around building awareness. But the other part that Jim will get to is kind of showing what it could become. And that's obviously the most important part. It's been very useful to get both community members, but probably most importantly, even council members excited about why we should invest money into something that seems impossible or insurmountable. When you see some of the pictures that were developed out of this, it all kind of starts to make sense.
This is an example of one of the existing historic buildings, and it was a key part of the lock. But you might be able to see that they've tried to board up and secure it, but people were still accessing the building, and one person got a little more than they could handle in terms of accessing wiring. This is an example of what the future is going to look like on the lock.
I think you scroll down, there's some renderings of, we built a trail that connects to it, and if you keep going, there's some views of plaza and other things that are planned there.
There we go.
Yeah.
The story map has these different icons, again, that they give viewpoint views. And so the story map was put together using GIS, photos, drone coverage, and then the renderings that Aaron talked about.
And I think it's a good example if you're dealing with a current EPA grant or you're thinking about applying for an EPA grant. I believe the rules are still the same. It's been a while. But we used to kind of approach those grants as sort of, okay, how many phase ones and phase twos can we get out of this, and cleanup plans. I don't remember when it happened, but there was an addition to allowing sort of planning work to occur. I think that was a key thing, because a lot of the smaller communities especially don't have the resources to put something like this together. Again, it's really important, not just in addressing the actual brownfield issues, but helping to then get people excited about what's coming next. So this is a cool feature that they added.
So this is the stone lock as it exists today, and then as you move the cursor across, this is the vision. And one thing I'll say about this is it really, for the city, it ties in stakeholders. It gives them a nice idea of what's going on in real time. This can be updated, but it's something that helps tie the community together. So EPA loves this, by the way, even though their grant application RFPs don't necessarily specify adding story maps. It's something that we firmly believe in. We think it's a great thing. And so, we typically are including that now in our responses or our applications on behalf of our clients. So, I see that we've got 15 minutes.
You want to go to the last slide just to do the...
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
How do I do that?
We'll go to the last slide, leave our contact information up there, but we have the takeaways I think we're supposed to talk about in terms of what are you taking away from this key points. I think when I was thinking about this slide, it was really from West Sacramento Story. Again, these are projects from very small to very large that we've done in West Sac. However, there are some common themes among them. First, they all tie back to some kind of plan, some kind of vision that our early leadership had. And there's nothing, it's great to have really bold vision, nothing wrong with that. But what we learned, I think, in that process is at some point you've got to follow that up with a realistic vision. You've got to put the pieces together in terms of, okay, if we want this outcome, is there a market to support it, or what do we have to do to create that market, including things like infrastructure and other things that really matter to private investors at the end of the day, cleaning up brownfields. Second, it's not just kind of sitting on that saying, cool, we have a plan. Why isn't anyone showing up to do anything? I think what I've learned in my career, especially working in a very challenged market, a city that didn't have everything sort of laid out for it, we had to really do that. We had to do what I believe many of you work in cities and work in sort of redevelopment-like functions. It's what we're here to do. It's to intervene in the market. We're supposed to go in, remove barriers, remove challenges that the private sector are just not going to take on. If you look at a site in West Sacramento, you look at a similar one across the river that doesn't have some of those challenges, what do you think a developer is going to do? So that's kind of the approach I encourage everyone to take, is put yourself in that mode of that early investment and take those actions that lead to kind of tipping the market in your favor, tipping the scales of the market. And then the last point on there is leverage, whether it's property, whether it's local funding that you have. We were fortunate, even though we're a small city, we did have very dedicated, the leadership at the time put a lot of stock behind our redevelopment agency. We put a lot of money of our own into some of these projects, but more than anything, it allowed us to leverage grant funds. We wouldn't have been able to get the $23 million grant for the Bridge District had it not been for the redevelopment work that had gone in up front. And EPA money can be a great source of that as well. It's early money. It can get some of that uncertainty resolved and get some of the planning work done so that you can get a site ready to tee it up for some of the bigger grant funds out there. And a lot of the ones we use are still out there, whether it's the IIG program. I know they've had funding challenges with the state budget, but also the AHSC program. I forgot to mention that on the Grand Gateway project. I think we were one of the first recipients of that program funding, and that went directly to fund the infrastructure that supported the affordable housing. So I think that's another great source for grant funding at the state level. So I'll keep going here if I don't stop. So I'm gonna stop here. We're gonna turn it over for questions, and Jim and I have, I think, another 15 minutes or so. So thank you. And our contact information is here.
Hey, I was going to ask, can you please describe what was the engagement with any tribal, Native American, and indigenous leaders in the design process? And also, did you incorporate any ecological restoration aspects?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we are on the confluence of the American and Sacramento Rivers, and so naturally we are in a location where there's a predominance of, or at least a high likelihood that we'll encounter, different cultural resources. So that's something we're no stranger to. Many of the projects that we did that I addressed, whether it was the Bridge District project, the Grand Gateway project, we actually did have times where we had to shut down and address those cultural resources and do the proper removal and reinternment of those resources. So in that process, and a lot of it's kind of environmental law driven, but we actually, in West Sacramento, we know this, so we kind of go out of our way to have good relationships with our tribes. So we engage them, they have the site monitors, and so that kind of covers the part that, what you're going to encounter during construction. I think the more important point to that question, though, is what are we doing with our redevelopment plans to celebrate that history? And I didn't mention this in one of the slides, but there was one where you can see a site where we're working with the state of California to actually relocate it's called the California Indian Heritage Center, which right now is in downtown Sacramento in a very small location. But it's a $200 million plus project. Land that the redevelopment agency once owned was turned over to the state to be part of that project. And so it's not just, kind of checking the boxes on as we develop the riverfront, we're doing all the legal requirements for monitoring and taking care of our cultural resources, but we're, kind of embracing the history of West Sacramento and what we do, not just with the museum project, but in other types of projects that we're doing and making sure that we're not just not overlooking the history, but also celebrating it. It's a little complicated in Sacramento because there's so many tribes in California that because of the confluence of the rivers, it was sort of a meeting place. And so it's not just one, it's not, some of you probably deal with one tribe regularly. We have at least 2 or 3. And so that's something that we just do as part of our culture and something we'll keep doing going forward. So thank you. Other questions? Oh, yes, ecological restoration. So obviously also this is an area that once was kind of a natural riparian habitat. The whole theme of the Bridge District is about, celebrating that, getting people outside. One thing that we whether, intentionally or not, the flood regulations in Sacramento post-Katrina are vastly different than before. So in other areas where we have hardscape up to the river or a park, we no longer can do that. So instead of saying, okay, well, we'll just do what we can and put a trail in, we're doing things to restore the native habitat in places along the river, especially down near Stonelock. There's quite a bit of that will happen with the reuse of that area, but also as we build levees, because we are surrounded by levees in West Sacramento, there are areas of the levee construction that have very large restoration areas. They also act as inundation areas, so some of the native vegetation has a chance to kind of repopulate there. So that's a key component of a lot of our projects, but especially on the flood program. Eric.
Yeah, well, thanks, Aaron and James. It's really good learning about the history in West Sacramento, and the case studies I think were really helpful. I have 2 questions. So first is, these are kind of long-term efforts, and you have councils and mayors that kind of change, turn over. How have you had support for this vision throughout the years generally, or have there been some moments where you really had to kind of get people together around that vision, and what were some strategies that you used there? And then the second one, if you could talk a little bit more about your EIFD and how that tax increment or any bonds you might issue as a part of that EIFD, like that you might commit to, you know, the brownfield redevelopment efforts and the vision that you've laid out for us.
Yeah, how does that tie in with the EIFD? Okay. Yeah, so on that first question, I'm glad you asked it. I alluded to this. I think one of the most beneficial circumstances we had in West Sacramento was stable council leadership. We had, for example, we had one mayor, we had a direct elect mayor for about 24 years. I think, spoke at one of these conferences in the past, Christopher Cabalden. He's now going to be our state senator, which is nice. But between him and other electeds, we had generally the same city councils for most of the city's history. There were some changes over the course of time. The 2020 election was, I think, for all of us, a big game changer, and so we had quite a bit of turnover on our council at that point. However, I will say anyone who is successful at winning elected office in West Sacramento understands that the city's best days are still ahead of it, and the future of the Bridge District and the Riverfront is, you know, really tied to their success. And so I think, because that's what the community wants. We didn't want to be this industrial backwater of Sacramento and Yolo County, kind of this confusing area of, you know, with what is the identity here. We wanted to embrace what we have as potential along the river and create a community where not just our residents can enjoy it, we can attract other people here, whether it's employers or visitors, and it's a great opportunity. So I think whoever the council is, and I'm speaking for our current council, and I know who might be next, they all kind of see that vision is still very relevant. I think some things have come up along the way. We've had growing pains just like any other city, addressing some of our core services, but by and large that has remained consistent even if the leadership hasn't. On your second question about EIFDs, I could you know, do a whole other hour-long panel on EIFDs, so don't ask me to. But I will say, as the key source of local funding, tax increment financing, no matter where you are in the United States, EIFDs is the best thing we have in California. It's not redevelopment. The circumstances vary greatly from city to city. However, for us, and I think for all of us in cities, it is the best thing we have. And you can fund brownfields, generally. It can be for assessment, remediation, anything, and as well as a slew of many, many other projects, including affordable housing, mainly infrastructure, but you name it, you can pretty much fund it with an EIFD. One of the questions I get a lot is, well, what if we don't get a lot of the property tax? And that's true. Yeah, that's a big challenge. It's a challenge for most cities. But the benefit of an EIFD, it's so much more flexible than redevelopment. You can set up a district today and capture the growth, but not really turn it on. It doesn't turn on until you issue bonds, and then you have 45 years. So it's a very useful tool. It's the best local funding source that every city has access to, even if your circumstances aren't the best for it. But unless you have other local revenue like sales tax money or other unique things, it's the best we're going to have for, I think, the rest of at least our careers. So I know you're a lot younger than me, but I'll still say that. All right, next question. Yes.
Hi, my name's Ariel. I'm actually born and raised in Sacramento, and about
cool.
20 minutes from a lot of your projects. The storyboard is really, the story map is really cool, so I'll probably check that out. But I have more of a local question for you. Mm-hmm. So, potential future war times, does this retire the lock permanently, or is it still going to be used in that way?
Right. Yeah, and then Jim can jump in if he has anything to add on this one. So, yeah, so the question was, is there any thinking about reopening the lock for actual shipping purposes? The short answer is no, and it's less to do with, you know, could it be used as a nice way to get from river to the bay? It would be nice. The factor that's come into play in the last 10 years has been flood control. So it's basically a hole in our city. And if the river floods, it goes into the lock. 'Cause they're actually, that's why the lock's there, they're different levels. The lock is actually lower than the channel is lower than the river. And so part of our long-term flood solution is to essentially wall off that location. And using the gates at the lock, you can kind of see it in the last picture there, as the, at the foreground of that top picture, we're going to basically put a flood wall right there. So because of that, it will be permanently closed. However, we are trying to incorporate something that would allow small watercraft and fish passage at least. And small watercraft is more for further down. because we have other flood control improvements that way, but between the river and the channel, it's going to be closed off. So, but yeah, good question. You have anything else there? Okay. Other questions?
Hi, I wanted to make a comment. Jim had asked me to link back to the stack and sequence workshop that was done on Tuesday. So if you weren't able to attend that, we started with building a database of brownfield redevelopment funding sources, and we're up to about 50 sources on that database. And we started there, and then the rest of that workshop was around stack and sequence, which is the concept of using multiple funding sources for brownfield projects that almost all require, excuse me, the stack is using multiple sources at the same time, often for the same type of activity. The sequence is using multiple sources, some stacked and some sequential in nature over the timeline of a brownfield project or an area. And so if you're interested in getting a copy of that presentation, you want a copy of the database, come up and see me or Jim afterwards. And then lastly is more of the comment of having done this for a very long time, and I speak a lot to municipalities about what they can do to promote redevelopment. I do not know of a better example of stack and sequence and what municipalities can do to promote redevelopment than what we have here in West Sacramento. So congratulations on that, on your success you've had.
We are happy to answer any other questions. We've got a minute, 30 seconds.
Okay, maybe last question.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Well, first, shout out to the Seattle Locks. Awesome place to go as a kid. And my question is around your project where you were able to get Shell to remediate to the residential standard.
Right.
Just curious if you could speak a little bit more about like what that negotiation looked like. We deal with that a lot here in LA. Or I work on oil sites, and getting the oil industry to do anything is very challenging. So
it was very interesting. I can't say we can speak as a model for anything, but I can tell you that part of that early discussion with Shell was sort of trying to figure out what their motivations were, and it became pretty clear that they were really in the mode of just divesting and getting out of town. So we knew they were highly motivated. We knew there were bigger things at play. And so I think we just really pushed that, and they, for whatever reason, were very much about, we want to control the kind of the regulatory process, not have any insight to it from us, but at least be in the lead on it. And so our deal was very clear, though. It was very plain language, to residential standard. They agreed. They settled on this number that was based on their perception of what it would cost to clean it up. And that was the basis of the transaction cost. We would obviously not have agreed to a number that was higher than what we saw as the real estate value. However, at the time, we thought that was about a match. So there was a little bit of, it was an interesting negotiation back and forth. They did at one point come back and want to change the standard. I know that's kind of what Jim was talking about when we brought in the water board and got their help, because our point was, no, the zoning here is for housing, mixed use, and that worked. So. Happy to follow up if you have more precise questions. We have other staff that worked in the later days of it, more on it than I did. I was sort of involved on the lead negotiations at the beginning. But we think it'll be a good model for the next project, which is further down the river. We have another tank farm that we need to deal with. So I think that's all the time we have. I want to just thank you all for being here, especially as one of the last sessions of the conference. I know that's always difficult, at least for me. Thank you to Jim and SES and Nino and Moore, our past consultants, and is Ignacio still here? Thank you, Ignacio. He taught me everything good there is to know about brownfield redevelopment, so if you don't know Ignacio, you should. He's been a great resource to me over the years, and thank you all for coming.